Welcome everyone to Brains and Barrels, our podcast deep diving into the wisdom of interwoven psychology, economics, and life lessons. And today we're discussing some of the key ideas from poor Charlie's Almanack. It's an impressively detailed collection of Charlie Munger's thoughts, ranging from incentive super response to social proof, and even what he calls Lollapalooza tendency.
Right, absolutely. What's fascinating to me is how Charlie lays out, in such a checklist format, 25 psychological tendencies that explain why smart people sometimes make misjudgments. He blends anecdotes from his own life, like his experiences with Berkshire Hathaway's decision-making, with lessons from historical figures like Benjamin Franklin, even drawing on ancient wisdom.
Yep, totally. Yeah, one of Charlie's big lessons is about how incentives affect behavior, a reward super response tendency, as he calls it. He explains with examples from Federal Express and even from an old Xerox case where salesmen's commissions ended up influencing, well, bad sales practices. It's amazing how he underscores that you need to get the incentives right.
Right, And then there's that whole discussion on how our inherent tendencies, like the liking, loving, and the disliking, hating tendencies, shape our decisions. Charlie shows us that people tend to overlook faults in what they love, while also, exaggerating flaws in what they despise.
Exactly. It's like he's warning us against letting our personal biases get in the way of rational decisions. He even mentions how a salesperson might get away with selling something expensive simply by associating it with something one loves, even if it's a trick. Another really interesting point is his idea about doubt avoidance and inconsistency avoidance. People, when faced with uncertainty, rush to make decisions and then refuse to change those conclusions.
It's almost like our brain's wired to fix opinions too early, and then we get stuck, right? Right. And that ties very closely with what he describes as the endowment effect and excessive self-regard. He tells us that people tend to overvalue what they already have and let it become part of their identity, often causing them to make irrational choices, like not selling a stock even when the pricing is clearly too high.
Absolutely. And then he uses rich examples from the world of investing, where inaction in high-stakes environments produces, as he puts it, Lollapalooza effects. Yeah, the Lollapalooza tendency is perhaps his signature point, how psychological tendencies combine to create extreme outcomes. Think about how he talks about the way a few small errors in, say, a stock option system or biased feedback in leadership can spiral into enormous financial or personal disasters.
Like the way he describes Quantek's downfall, when the cumulative missteps turned a thriving company into a cautionary tale. Exactly. And Charlie doesn't just stop with pointing out problems. He's also big on antidotes. For example, he champions the use of checklists so that decision makers can sidestep these pitfalls.
That's one thing I appreciate a lot. His insistence on a disciplined, almost pilot-like rigor. Just like how pilots use simulators, he urges us to use mental checklists to avoid missing any psychological bias, right? And he also stresses the importance of multidisciplinary learning. He argues that a lot of the shortcomings in fields like economics come from not incorporating insights from psychology, biology, and even literature. It's like he's saying, if you want to truly understand human misjudgment, you have to broaden your vision beyond a single discipline.
And that's why he recommends books that range from economics to Darwin's theories, to even works on negotiation like Getting to Yes. Speaking of books, one of the charming parts of the Almanack is his recommended reading list. It's almost a must-read list for anyone who wants to build a solid framework for thinking about life, business, and even interpersonal relationships.
Yep. Books like Influence by Robert Cialdini and The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins are there to remind us how deeply our behaviors are shaped by both biological and cultural evolution. Right. And he also touches on the idea of reason-respecting tendency, how people in general love a good explanation. But then he warns that even that tendency can be manipulated. For instance, a persuasive speaker might offer reasons that sound compelling on the surface, leading you to accept flawed conclusions.
It's a subtle reminder to always be skeptical, even of arguments that seem reasonable at first glance. And don't forget his discussion of social proof. He notes how we're heavily influenced by what others are doing. If everyone around you is acting in a certain way, you're more likely to follow suit, even if it's totally irrational.
Like how in business you might end up overpaying for something in an open outcry auction simply because everyone else is bidding high. Yes, and that ties into his analysis of contrast misreaction tendency. Our perception often gets skewed by relative comparisons rather than absolute values. He gives hilarious examples like a high-priced product seeming even more attractive because it's, say, compared to something even more exorbitantly priced.
It's that cognitive shortcut that, in the end, might lead us to make decisions counter to our best interests. Absolutely. Another standout from Charlie's talks is his emphasis on the use it or lose it tendency. It's a reminder that no skill or insight will stay sharp if you don't continuously practice.
Right, and that's why he quotes things like a famous pianist's need to practice every single day. Even a day's lapse can make the performance noticeably worse. Then, there's the authority misinfluence tendency, which warns us that we can be unduly swayed by figures in power, even when their orders or suggestions are frankly absurd.
Exactly, and he gives examples from both military and business life, like how a subordinate might blindly follow a leader's incorrect orders. And of course, all these tendencies can culminate in what he calls the Lollapalooza tendency, when multiple biases combine in a reinforcing way and produce extreme outcomes.
That's really the grand summary of his approach. It's a meta-psychological insight that explains why smart investors sometimes make huge mistakes, and conversely, how correct application of these principles can lead to extraordinary success. Right. And he wraps up by highlighting that while these biases are part of human nature, awareness of them through continual learning and disciplined checklists can help us mitigate their negative effects.
It's a kind of cognitive self-defense mechanism. You build up your awareness so that you're not constantly blindsided by your own mind. I also love how he connects these psychological insights to practical matters in investing and business management. Not only does he expose how these biases have led to tragedies like the quant tech scandal, but he also offers, in his inimitable style, lessons on how to structure incentives, design checklists, and even choose leadership wisely.
Yes, it's almost like he wants to instill a culture of trust and rationality in business, a culture that values long-term thought rather than short-term impulsivity. And his recommendations aren't just academic, they have real-world applications. For instance, how a company might emulate the cash register model to minimize fraud, or how a manager should rely on long-term, passivity-based investments rather than constantly chasing quick gains.
Exactly. And that's why so many business leaders, like Warren Buffett, have found his insights so invaluable. It's the blend of philosophy and practical analysis that sets his work apart. Indeed. And to think, all of this comes together in a sort of grand synthesizing vision, multidisciplinary thinking that draws from psychology, economics, biology, and even literature and history.
Right. It's that holistic approach that really makes someone like Charlie Munger a rarity. People who can connect historical wisdom from Poor Richard's Almanack, evolutionary insights from Darwin, and modern behavioral finance are extremely scarce. It definitely encourages us as listeners to be lifelong learners, to read voraciously, and even, to be a little skeptical of our own first conclusions.
And that idea of don't let your first conclusion become wall-to-wall truth is so important. It's like he's urging us to re-examine our biases continuously. Absolutely. And speaking of lifelong learning, one of his most charming pieces of advice, which he echoes from Benjamin Franklin, is spend each day trying to be a little wiser than you were when you woke up.
Yes, it's simple yet profound. That notion encapsulates his whole philosophy on learning, investment, and frankly, living a good life. I love that because it emphasizes that wisdom isn't something you're born with. It's something you build over time through practice, reflection, and a willingness to challenge your own thinking.
Right. And it's a reminder that we should always be aware of our own limitations, of our inconsistencies, our biases, and our tendencies to follow the crowd. And also of not letting, say, intense personal emotions, like envy or pride, override common sense and sound judgment. Charlie's emphasis on principles like don't let incentive-caused bias blind you really drives home that point.
Definitely. And it's a lesson that I think applies not only to investors, but to all decision makers, whether in business, politics, or personal life. So to wrap things up, what I find most inspiring about Charlie Munger's approach is how he combines a sort of cold, logical checklist with an acknowledgement of our messy human emotions. He teaches us that while we might never completely eliminate our biases, we can use self-awareness, checklists, and multidisciplinary curiosity to at least mitigate their destructive effects.
Yeah, it's a call to appeal to our inner practicality, not just to be smart, but to be wise about how we behave and make decisions. I totally agree. And for our listeners, taking away even a couple of these insights, such as the necessity of remaining skeptical of your own first conclusions and the importance of constructing a personal mental checklist, could really change how they approach both investing and everyday life.
Exactly. Whether you're an investor making billion-dollar decisions or just someone trying to negotiate daily challenges, these psychological insights are, in a word, invaluable. So, as we sign off today, remember poor Charlie's key message. Continuous learning, disciplined self-examination, and a willingness to challenge your biases are the tools to making better decisions.
Right on. And as Charlie himself famously concludes, I have nothing to add, not because there's nothing left to say, but because the wisdom is meant to speak for itself. Thank you all for joining us on Brains and Barrels. We hope these insights inspire you to become a better thinker, investor, and ultimately, a wiser person in all aspects of life.
Yes, thanks for listening, and don't forget, keep those checklists handy and never stop learning.